Talk. Crisis of 1855 and breakup of the Peelites. 1855. Party has no doubt its evils, but all the evils of party put together would be scarcely a grain in the balance, when compared with the dissolution of honorable friendships, the pursuit of selfish ends, the want of concert in council, the absence of a settled policy in foreign affairs, the corruption of certain statesmen, the caprices of an intriguing court, which the extinction of party connection has brought and would bring again upon this country. Earl Russell, 337. The administrative miscarriages of the war in the Crimea during the winter of 1854-5 destroyed the coalition government. 338. When Parliament assembled on January 23, 1855, Mr. Roebuck on the first night of the session gave notice of a motion for a committee of inquiry. Lord John Russell attended to the formal business, and when the House was up went home accompanied by Sir Charles Wood. Nothing of consequence passed between the two colleagues, and no word was said to Wood in the direction of withdrawal. The same evening as the Prime Minister was sitting in his drawing-room, a red box was brought in to him by his son, containing Lord John Russell's resignation. He was as much amazed as Lord Newcastle, smoking his evening pipe of tobacco in his coach, was amazed by the news that the Battle of Marston Moor had begun. Nothing has come to light since to set aside the severe judgment pronounced upon this proceeding by the universal opinion of contemporaries, including Lord John's own closest political allies. That a minister should run away from a hostile motion upon affairs for which responsibility was collective, and this without a word of consultation with a single colleague, is a transaction happily without a precedent in the history of modern English cabinets. 339. It opened an intricate and unexpected chapter of affairs. The ministerial crisis of 1855 was unusually prolonged. It was interesting as a drama of character and motive. It marked a decisive stage in the evolution of party, and it was one of the turning points in the career of the subject of this biography. Fortunately for us, Mr. Gladstone has told in his own way the whole story of what he calls this sharp and difficult passage in public affairs, and he might have added that it was a sharp passage in his own life. His narrative, with the omission of some details now dead and indifferent, and of a certain number of repetitions, is the basis of this chapter. Lord John's resignation. On the day following Lord John's letter the Cabinet met, and the Prime Minister told them that at first he thought it meant the breakup of the government, but on further consideration he thought they should hold on, if it could be done with honor and utility. Newcastle suggested his own resignation, and the substitution of Lord Palmerston in his place. Palmerston agreed that the country, rightly or wrongly, wished to see him at the War Office, but he was ready to do whatever his colleagues thought best. The Whigs thought resignation necessary. Mr. Gladstone thought otherwise, and scouted the suggestion that as Newcastle was willing to resign, Lord John might come back. Lord John himself actually sent a sort of message to know whether he should attend the cabinet. In the end Lord Aberdeen carried all their resignations to the Queen. These she declined to accept, and she urged with the greatest eagerness that the decision should be reconsidered. It is hard at this distance of time to understand how any cabinet under national circumstances of such gravity could have thought of the ignominy of taking to flight from a motion of censure, whatever a single colleague like Lord John Russell might deem honorable. On pressure from the Queen, the Whigs in the government, Lord John notwithstanding, agreed to stand fire. Mr. Gladstone proceeds. Lord John's explanation, which was very untrue in its general effect, though I believe kindly conceived in feeling as well as tempered with some grains of policy and a contemplation of another possible premiership, carried the House with him, as Herbert observed while he was speaking. Palmerston's reply to him was wretched. It produced in the House, that is, in so much of the House as would otherwise have been favorable, a flatness and deadness of spirit towards the government which was indescribable, and Charles Wood with a marked expression of face said while it was going on, "And this is to be our leader." I was myself so painfully full of the scene, that when Palmerston himself sat down I was on the very point of saying to him unconsciously, "Can anything more be said?" But no one would rise in the adverse sense, and therefore there was no opening for a minister. Palmerston, now become leader in the Commons, had written to ask me to follow Lord John on account of his being a party. But it was justly thought in the cabinet that there were good reasons against my taking this part upon me, and so the arrangement was changed. Roebuck brought forward his motion. Mr. Gladstone resisted it on behalf of the government with immense argumentative force, and he put the point against Lord John which explains the word untrue in the passage just quoted, namely, that though he desired in November the substitution of Palmerston for Newcastle as War Minister, he had given it up in December, and yet this vital fact was omitted. 340. It was not for the government, he said, either to attempt to make terms with the House by reconstruction of a cabinet, or to shrink from any judgment of the House upon their acts. If they had so shrunk, he exclaimed, this is the sort of epitaph that he would expect to have written over their remains. Here lie the dishonored ashes of a ministry that found England in peace and left it at war, that was content to enjoy the emoluments of office and to wield the scepter of power, so long as no man had the courage to question their existence. They saw the storm gathering over the country. They heard the agonizing accounts that were almost daily received of the sick and wounded in the East. These things did not move them, but so soon as a member of opposition raised his hand to point the thunderbolt, they became conscience-stricken into a sense of guilt, and hoping to escape punishment, they ran away from duty. Such would be their epitaph. Of the proposed inquiry itself, an inquiry into the conduct of generals and troops actually in the field, and fighting by the side of, and in concert with, foreign allies, he observed, your inquiry will never take place as a real inquiry, or, if it did, it would lead to nothing but confusion and disturbance, increased disasters, shame at home and weakness abroad. It would convey no consolation to those whom you seek to aid, but it would carry malignant joy to the hearts of the enemies of England, and, for my part, I shall ever rejoice, if this motion is carried tonight, that my own last words as a member of the cabinet of the Earl of Aberdeen have been words of solemn and earnest protest against a proceeding which has no foundation either in the Constitution or in the practice of preceding parliaments, which is useless and mischievous for the purpose which it appears to contemplate, and which, in my judgment, is full of danger to the power, dignity, and usefulness of the Commons of England. A journalistic observer, while deploring the speaker's adherence to the dark dogmatisms of medieval religionists, admits that he had never heard so fine a speech. The language, he says, was devoid of redundance. The attitude was calm. Mr. Gladstone seemed to feel that he rested upon the magnitude of the argument, and had no need of the assistance of bodily vehemence of manner. His voice was clear, distinct, and flexible, without monotony. It was minute dissection without bitterness or ill-humored innuendo. He sat down amid immense applause from hearers admiring but unconvinced. Mr. Gladstone himself records of this speech, hard and heavy work, especially as to the cases of three persons, Lord John Russell, Duke of Newcastle, and Lord Raglan. Ministers were beaten, January 29, by 325 to 148, and they resigned. January 30, 1855. Cabinet 1-2. We exchanged friendly adieus. Dined with the Herberts. This was a day of personal light-heartedness, but the problem for the nation is no small one. End of the coalition. The Queen sent for Lord Derby, and he made an attempt to form a government. Without aid from the Conservative wing of the fallen ministry there was no hope, and his first step, January 31, was to call on Lord Palmerston, with an earnest request for his support, and with a hope that he would persuade Mr. Gladstone and Sidney Herbert to rejoin their old political connection, with the intimation moreover that Mr. Disraeli, with a self-abnegation that did him the highest credit, was willing to waive in Lord Palmerston's favour his own claim to the leadership of the House of Commons. Palmerston was to be President of the Council, and Ellenborough Minister of War. In this conversation Lord Palmerston made no objection on any political grounds, or on account of any contemplated measures. He found no fault with the position intended for himself, or for others with whom he would be associated. Lord Derby supposed that all would depend on the concurrence of Mr. Gladstone and Herbert. He left Cambridge House at 2:30 in the afternoon, and at 9:30 in the evening he received a note from Lord Palmerston declining 3 hours later he heard from Mr. Gladstone, who declined also. The proceedings of this eventful day, between 2 in the afternoon and midnight, whatever may have been the play of motive and calculation in the innermost minds of all or any of the actors, were practically to go a long way, though by no means the whole way, as we shall see, towards making Mr. Gladstone's severance from the Conservative Party definitive. January 31. Lord Palmerston came to see me between 3 and 4, with a proposal from Lord Derby that he and I, with S. Herbert, should take office under him, Palmerston to be President of the Council and lead the House of Commons. Not finding me when he called before, he had gone to S. Herbert, who seemed to be disinclined. I inquired, 1. Whether Derby mentioned Graham? 2. Whether he had told Lord Palmerston if his persevering with the commission he had received would depend on the answer to this proposal. 3. How he was himself inclined. He answered the 2 first questions in the negative, and said as to the third, though not keenly, that he felt disinclined, but that if he refused it would be attributed to his contemplating another result, which other result he considered would be agreeable to the country. I then argued strongly with him that though he might form a government, and though if he formed it, he would certainly start it amidst immense clapping of hands, yet he could not have any reasonable prospect of stable parliamentary support. On the one hand would stand Derby with his phalanx, on the other Lord J. Russell, of necessity a centre and nucleus of discontent, and between these two there would and could be no room for a parliamentary majority such as would uphold his government. He argued only rather faintly the other way, and seemed rather to come to my way of thinking. I said that even if the proposition were entertained, there would be much to consider, that I thought it clear, whatever else was doubtful, that we could not join without him, for in his absence the wound would not heal kindly again, that I could not act without Lord Aberdeen's approval, nor should I willingly separate myself from Graham, that if we joined, we must join in force. But I was disposed to wish that if all details could be arranged, we should join in that manner rather than that Derby should give up the commission, though I thought the best thing of all would be Derby forming a ministry of his own men, provided only he could get a good or fair foreign secretary instead of Clarendon, who in any case would be an immense loss. I went off to speak to Lord Aberdeen, and Palmerston went to speak to Clarendon, with respect to whom he had told Derby that he could hardly enter any government which had not Clarendon at the Foreign Office. When we reassembled, I asked Lord Palmerston whether he had made up his mind for himself independently of us, inasmuch as I thought that if he had, that was enough to close the whole question? He answered, yes, that he should tell Derby he did not think he could render him useful service in his administration. He then laughed. It was perhaps 6.30. Herbert and I sat down to write, but thought it well to send off nothing till after dinner, and we went to Grillion's where we had a small but merry party. Herbert even beyond himself amusing. At night we went to Lord Aberdeen's and Graham's, and so my letter came through some slight emendations to the foreman which it went, 341. I had doubts in my mind whether Derby had even intended to propose to Herbert and me except in conjunction with Palmerston, though I had no doubt that without Palmerston it would not do, and I framed my letter so as not to assume that I had an independent proposal, but to make my refusal a part of his. February 2. I yesterday also called on Lord Palmerston and read him my letter to Lord Derby. He said, nothing can be better. Lord Derby's proposals. Lord Derby knew that, though he had the country gentlemen behind him, his own political friends, with the notable and only half-welcome exception of Mr. Disraeli, were too far below mediocrity in either capacity or experience to face so angry and dangerous a crisis. Accordingly he gave up the task. Many years after, Mr. Gladstone recorded his opinion that here Lord Derby missed his one real chance of playing a high historic part. To a Derby government, he said, now that the party had been drubbed out of protection, I did not in principle object, for old ties were with me more operatively strong than new opinions, and I think that Lord Derby's error in not forming an administration was palpable and even gross. Such, it has appeared, was the opinion of Disraeli, 342. Lord Derby had many fine qualities, but strong parliamentary courage was not among them. When Lord Palmerston, probably with a sagacious discernment of the immediate future, declined, he made no separate offer to the Peelites. Had Lord Derby gone on, he would have been supported by the country, then absorbed in the consideration of the war. None of the 3 occasions when he took office offered him so fine an opportunity as this, but he missed it. On the previous day, Mr. Gladstone Records saw Mr. Disraeli in the House of Lords and put out my hand, which was very kindly accepted. To nobody was the hour fraught with more bitter mortification than to Mr. Disraeli, who beheld a golden chance of bringing a consolidated party into the possession of real power flung away. 2. Error of refusing Lord Lansdowne. Next, at the Queen's request, soundings in the Whig and Peelite waters were undertaken by Lord Lansdowne, and he sent for Mr. Gladstone, with a result that to the latter was ever after matter of regret. February 2. In consequence of a communication from Lord Lansdowne, I went to him in the forenoon and found him just returned from Windsor. He trusted I should not mind speaking freely to him, and I engaged to do it, only premising that in so crude and dark a state of facts, it was impossible to go beyond first impressions. We then conversed on various combinations, as 1. Lord J. Russell, Premier, 2. Lord Palmerston, 3. Lord Clarendon, 4. Lord Lansdowne himself. Of the first I doubted whether, in the present state of feeling, he could get a ministry on its legs. In answer to a question from him, I added that I thought, viewing my relations to Lord Aberdeen and to Newcastle, and his to them also, the public feeling would be offended, and it would not be for the public interest if I were to form part of his government, i.e. Russell's. Of the second I said that it appeared to me Lord Palmerston could not obtain a party majority. Aloof from him would stand on the one hand Derby and his party, on the other Lord J. Russell, who I took it for granted would never serve under him. Whatever the impression made by Russell's recent conduct, yet his high personal character and station, 40 years' career, one half of it in the leadership of his party, and the close connection of his name with all the great legislative changes of the period, must ever render him a power in the state, and render it impossible for a government depending on the Liberal party to live independently of him. I also hinted at injurious effects which the substitution of Palmerston for Lord Aberdeen would produce on foreign powers at this critical moment, but dwelt chiefly on the impossibility of his having a majority. In this Lord Lansdowne seemed to agree. Lastly, I said that if Lord Lansdowne himself could venture to risk his health and strength by taking the government, this would be the best arrangement. My opinion was that at this crisis Derby, if he could have formed an administration, would have had advantages with regard to the absorbing questions of the war and of a peace to follow it, such as no other combination could possess. Failing this, I wished for a homogeneous Whig government. The best form of it would be under him. He said he might dare it provisionally, if he could see his way to a permanent arrangement at the end of a short term, but he could see nothing of the sort at present. An autobiographic note of 1897 gives a further detail of moment. He asked whether I would continue to hold my office as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the event of his persevering. He said that if I gave an affirmative reply he would persevere with the commission, and I think intimated that except on this condition he would not. I said that the working of the coalition since its formation in December 1852 had been to me entirely satisfactory, but that I was not prepared to cooperate in its continuation under any other head than Lord Aberdeen. I think that though perfectly satisfied to be in a Peelite government which had Whigs or Radicals in it, I was not ready to be in a Whig government which had Peelites in it. It took a long time, with my slow-moving and tenacious character, for the Ethiopian to change his skin. In the paper that I have already mentioned, as recording what, when all was near an end, he took to be some of the errors of his life, Mr. Gladstone names as one of those errors this refusal in 1855 to join Lord Lansdowne. I can hardly suppose, he says, more than 40 years after that time, that the eventual failure of the Queen's overture to Lord Lansdowne was due to my refusal, but that refusal undoubtedly constituted one of his difficulties and helped to bring about the result. I have always looked back upon it with pain as a serious and even gross error of judgment. It was, I think, injurious to the public, if it contributed to the substitution as Prime Minister of Lord Palmerston for Lord Lansdowne, a personage of greater dignity, and I think a higher level of political principle. There was no defect in Lord Lansdowne sufficient to warrant my refusal. He would not have been a strong or very active Prime Minister, but the question of the day was the conduct of the war, and I had no right to take exception to him as a head in connection with this subject. His attitude in domestic policy was the same as Palmerston's, but I think he had a more unprejudiced and liberal mind, though less of motive force in certain directions. 3. Fruitless negotiations. The next day Mr. Gladstone called on Lord Aberdeen, who for the first time let drop a sort of opinion as to their duties in the crisis on one point. Hitherto he had restrained himself. He said, certainly the most natural thing under the circumstances, if it could have been brought about in a satisfactory form, would have been that you should have joined Derby. On returning home, Mr. Gladstone received an important visitor and a fruitless visit. At 2:30 today Lord John Russell was announced, and sat till 3, his hat shaking in his hand. A communication had reached him late last night from the Queen, charging him with the formation of a government, and he had thought it his duty to make the endeavour. I repeated to him what I had urged on Lord Lansdowne, that a coalition with advantages has also weaknesses of its own, that the late coalition was I thought fully justified by the circumstances under which it took place, but at this juncture it had broken down. This being so, I thought what is called a homogeneous government would be best for the public, and most likely to command approval. That Derby, if he could get a good foreign minister, would have had immense advantages with respect to the great questions of war and peace. Lord John agreed as to Derby, thought that every one must have supported him, and that he ought to have persevered. I held to my point, adding that I did not think Lord Aberdeen and Lord Palmerston represented opposite principles, but rather different forms of the same principles connected with different habits and temperaments. He said that Lord Palmerston had agreed to lead the House of Commons for him, he going as First Minister to the Lords, but he did not mention any other alteration. Upon the whole his tone was low and doubtful. He asked whether my answer was to be considered as given, or whether I would take time. But I said as there was no probability that my ideas would be modified by reflection, it would not be fair to him to ask any delay. With the single exception of Lord Palmerston, none of his colleagues would have anything to do with Lord John, some even declining to go to see him. Wood came to Mr. Gladstone, evidently in the sense of the Palmerston premiership. He declared that Aberdeen was impossible, to which, says Mr. Gladstone, I greatly demurred. 4. Thus the two regular party leaders had failed. Lord Aberdeen, the coalition leader, was almost universally known to be out of the question. The public was loudly clamouring for Lord Palmerston. A Palmerston ministry was now seen to be inevitable. Were the Peelites, then, having refused Lord Derby, having refused Lord John, having told Lord Lansdowne that he had better form a system of homogeneous Whigs, now finally to refuse Lord Palmerston, on no better ground than that they could not have Lord Aberdeen, whom nobody save themselves would consent on any terms to have? To propound such a question was to answer it. Lord Aberdeen himself, with admirable freedom from egotism, pressed the point that in addition to the argument of public necessity, they owed much to their late Whig colleagues, who behaved so nobly and so generously towards us after Lord John's resignation. I have heard club talk and society talk, wrote an adherent to Mr. Gladstone late one night, February 4th, and I am sure that in the main any government containing good names in the cabinet, provided Lord John is not in it, will obtain general support. Lord Clarendon is universally, or nearly so, looked on as essential. Next to him, I think you are considered of vital importance in your present office. After all, rightly or wrongly, Lord Palmerston is master of the situation in the country, he is looked upon as the man. If the country sees you and Sidney Herbert holding aloof from him, it will be said the Peelites are selfish intriguers. The same evening, another correspondent said to Mr. Gladstone, 2 or 3 people have come in since 11 o'clock with the news of Brooks's and the reform. Exultation prevails there, and the certainty of Palmerston's success tomorrow. There is a sort of rumour prevalent that Lord Palmerston may seek Lord J. Russell's aid. This would, of course, negative all idea of your joining in the concern. Otherwise a refusal would be set down as sheer impracticability, or else the selfish ambition of a clique which could not stand alone, and should no longer attempt to do so. If the refusal to join Palmerston is to be a going over to the other side, and a definite junction within a brief space, that is clear and intelligible. But a refusal to join Lord Palmerston and yet holding out to him a promise of support, is a half measure which no one will understand, and which, I own, I cannot see the grounds to defend. Palmerston forms a ministry. We shall now find how after long and strenuous dubitation, the Peelite leaders refused to join on the 5th of February, and then on the 6th they joined. Unpromising from the very first cabinet, the junction was destined to a swift and sudden end. Here is the story told by one of the two leading actors.